Okay, so good morning. We start off today's session with this lecture by Christian, and he'll be talking about some of his recent work on reciprocity in complex environments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you to everyone for getting up early, even if it's late in the week, and I guess we are all a bit tired, but yeah, it's appreciated. Yeah, before I start, are there any questions about what I talked earlier about? So like replicated dynamics, Moran process, direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, or all good so far? Yeah, very good, things are clear. Okay, so today I would like to talk a little bit about what I call reciprocity in complex environments. Well, obviously this is an umbrella term that I just made up. So what I will talk about specifically is like 3 different areas that I'm working on at the moment. So one area is like the role of memory. So yesterday we talked a lot about memory one strategies of direct reciprocity. So one natural question is what happens if you increase this one? Another question is like the effect of changing environments. So in repeated games, usually you assume you play the same game over and over again, and that might not be a very realistic assumption in all cases. And the last thing is like the impact of inequality. So far I've only mostly talked about symmetric games. I would like to talk a little bit about reciprocity in asymmetric games. All right. So let me start. So yesterday we just discussed direct reciprocity, and for that we looked at the repeated prisoners dilemma. And so one thing that I told you that there's this famous experiment by Robert Axelrod. He invited 14 other researchers to submit strategies. Like some of these strategies were very cool, very sophisticated. But in the end, the simplest strategy won, tit for tat. But I also told you, well, it's a great result. It has been hugely influential for the field, but you should take it a little bit with a grain of salt. You shouldn't interpret it as saying, well, tit for tat is the best strategy in the world. Because like the success of tit for tat pretty much depends on which strategies you allow to participate in this experiment. Then I tried to convince you or persuade you that instead of perhaps looking at these 14 arbitrary strategies, it might make more sense to look at a simple but kind of representative strategy space, the space of memory one strategies. And perhaps I even gave the impression that everything is good in memory one strategies, like now you don't need to bother anymore, that you forgot important strategies that could change everything. But obviously that's not necessarily true. Like, how can we be sure that those results in the memory one space are robust? In the sense that, I mean, so one question that you might have is like, if you do instead simulations for memory two strategies, are results totally different, perhaps? Or the other question that you might have is, like, even if you find now a memory one strategy to be successful, like I guess yesterday, like I talked about this paper by Martin Nowak and Carl Sigmund, who found that this win-still-shift strategy is a very cool strategy that performs really well in these simulations. But you might want to ask yourself, well, once I allow for strategies with higher memory, perhaps those could invade win-still-shift. So that's kind of the question that we are asking now. Because like if you think about it intuitively, like it seems that if you have more memory than your opponent, perhaps you can take advantage of the opponent somehow. If you use the fact somehow cleverly that you know a little bit more than the opponent does, perhaps you can get more than the opponent. Okay, so let me first address this second question. Like perhaps strategies that are stable within the memory one space would stop to be stable if you allow for large memory. And it turns out that this cannot be, that this is never the case. And so the result is the following. I mean, I call this completeness of the memory one strategies. And the result is the following. Suppose I play some memory one strategy P. And suppose you play some very sophisticated, higher memory strategy Q. And suppose as a result of this interaction, we get a payoff of pi 1 and pi 2. Now the result is, well, you could find an equivalent strategy, Q, how do I call it here, Q star, which is a memory one strategy, which gives exactly the same payoffs. By the way, this is not a result that I came up with. Yeah, this is again a result by these two very clever gentlemen. As a side result, so this paper is all about zero determinant strategies, but as a side result, they also proved this result. So just to give you an interpretation what this means, when I already know that you play a memory 1 strategy, anything I can do against you, I can already do with another memory 1 strategy. And I mean, what is the intuition? Like the proof is actually kind of constructive. Like suppose you start with this strategy P, and suppose I have this strategy P, you have this very sophisticated strategy Q, then, well, we will get some sequence of actions. Suppose this is this, suppose this is what we do, and so on. And then, like, for example, you could check every time we have a CC here. And then I just check what is it that Q does. So here, for example, it cooperated with probability 1. Here there is also a CC, it cooperated with probability 1. Here there is also a CC, I would check what is it that Q does the next time. And then I would just calculate the statistical average of all these conditional cooperation probabilities. And then if I define this Q star to be this QCC, QCD, QDC, QDD, perhaps I should make stars everywhere. If you just define this QCC star to be the statistical average of how this very sophisticated strategy on average reacts to a CC, then you can show that you will get exactly the same payoffs against this memory 1 player. All right, and so a simple result, a simple consequence of this result is actually, if I want to check whether a memory 1 strategy is a Nash equilibrium, usually I would have to check it against all other possible strategies for the repeated business lemma. And there are infinitely many. But a consequence of this result is I don't need to check it against all complex strategies. It suffices to check it against all other memory 1 strategies. Because if no other memory 1 strategy can invade, then no other more complex strategy can invade. Because for each complex strategy, you could find a memory 1 strategy. Okay? All right, so that makes, I guess if you want to prove that a given strategy P is now a Nash equilibrium, that makes things a little bit easier because you don't need to check all possible strategies. It doesn't make it, well, incredibly easier because still there are uncountably many memory 1 strategies. So in principle, you would still have to check uncountably many memory 1 strategies that could possibly deviate. Now things turn out to be even more easier. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Can you still say that you can reduce both their strategies to an equivalent memory 1 strategy?
Unfortunately not. But what you can do is, if I play a memory 3 strategy and you play a memory 5 strategy, you can find an equivalent memory 3 strategy. So usually the player with the lower memory, he sets like the limit.
Not necessarily only memory 1, it's the lowest memory strategy.
That's right, yeah. So actually, present Dyson's result is a little bit more general. I here presented the version of memory 1, but they actually showed the more general case. Yeah?
So this is very similar to the result in repeated games played by finite state automata.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there are similar results, I believe, by Rubinstein and one other author that show a similar kind of result for finite state automata. Yeah, please. Yes and no. So what this statement says, if I already know that you are a low memory 1 strategy, I can also switch to a low memory 1 strategy if I only want to optimize my performance against you. But like, for example, if the population is heterogeneous and you play your memory 1 strategy, Sylvia plays a different memory 1 strategy, then it's no longer true that the best response to your both strategies is in the memory 1 space, for example. So if I want to simultaneously be good against many other players, at that point, it might actually be worth to have a higher memory. So at that point, it might still be possible to have an advantage from having higher memory.
This is just between two players.
Yeah, this is just if I already know you're a memory 1 player and I want to find the best response against you, I can find it within memory 1. Yeah, all right. Still, like, there are uncountably many memory 1 strategies, so still you have some work to do if you want to prove that any given memory 1 strategy is a Nash equilibrium. it turns out things are even a bit easier. And this is a result by Ethan Aiken. Suppose now P is a nice memory one strategy. So nice means I'm nice if I'm never the first one to defect. So in the first round, I would cooperate. And given that we all cooperated so far, I would again cooperate. So this is a nice strategy. And then the strategy P is a Nash equilibrium if and only if neither all D can invade, nor this other strategy. So it's a little bit 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. So in the first round, it starts defecting, and then it cooperates if and only if not both players cooperate in the previous round. So the proof is very elegant, but unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it. But just computationally, this makes things much easier because now I only need to check 2 possible deviations. So it's very easy to check now whether any given nice strategy is a Nash equilibrium. You could get similar results now for other kinds of memory one strategies. So for nasty memory one strategies that start defecting and would never be the first to cooperate, just like, I guess in our field, we are generally interested in those strategies that give cooperation. All right? And now, I mean, this is a great result. So this tells me I can identify that the Nash equilibria among the memory one strategies fairly easily because similar results hold for other types of the Nash equilibria. And I guess now we could get excited. We could say, wow, now that it's really easy to identify Nash equilibrium among the memory one strategies, perhaps we can do a similar trick in memory 2 or memory 3 and this kind of stuff. And perhaps also there will be a finite set of strategies that I need to test. So let's try that. So this is one kind of motivation for why we would like to be interested in high memory. The other motivation is, more generally, we would like to know, how does memory capacity affect the evolution of cooperation? Because, obviously, direct reciprocity is somehow based on memory. Direct reciprocity doesn't work if you have no memory at all. But the question is, does more memory always help, or is there at some point diminishing returns, where more memory doesn't help anymore? All right. So this is our plan. Unfortunately, things are a little bit tricky. Things are a bit tricky because, just the dimension, the size of the strategy space increases very rapidly. So if I already restrict myself to pure strategies, so pure strategies, I mean those strategies that only have cooperation probabilities of 0 or 1, that are deterministic at each point. So in the memory one space, if I ignore the outcome of the first round, there are 16 pure memory one strategies. Because you have PCC, PCD, PDC, PDD, so it's 2 to the 4, which is 16. Any guesses how many memory 2 strategies are out there? How many pure memory 2 strategies? Give me an order. 1,000? Okay. More or less? Yeah. All right, it's 65,536. Any guesses how many pure memory 3 strategies are out there? Yeah, so you get the sense it's something like exponential or even faster. Yeah, it turns out it's roughly 10 to the 19. And so the mathematical formula is this 2 to the 2 to the 2 of n. And this formula looks a little bit inconspicuous, but the numbers get very large very quickly. So in particular, if you want to do simulations among all pure memory 3 strategies, I mean, that's no longer feasible. You cannot explore a space with 10 to the 19 strategies numerically. At least I cannot. Perhaps you are much smarter than I am. So this is one problem. Another problem is, even if I don't want to explore all possible strategies, I just want to analyze what happens between 2 strategies, and I want to calculate their payoffs. So yesterday I told you how to calculate payoffs among 2 memory 1 players. You define a Markov chain, then you have this transition matrix. You compute the left eigenvector of this transition matrix, then you're good. And you can do the same thing for memory 2 strategies, and you can do the same thing for memory 3 strategies. You can still represent it as a Markov chain, where the states are just the history so far of length n. The transition matrix becomes larger and larger. So for example, for memory 1, we had 4 by 4. For memory 2, we had 16 by 16. For memory 3, we had 64 times 64. And obviously, you always need to calculate eigenvectors of such a huge beast. And that's a little bit, yeah, I guess numerically you can still do 64 by 64. It's not a problem. Analytically, it's hard. Also, like, quickly, I believe at memory 5 or memory 6, like, it even becomes hard if you do it naively to just do it numerically. All right. So one idea that we had is, okay, perhaps we shouldn't attack the space of memory n strategies directly. Perhaps it's beneficial to work with a slightly simpler strategy space. And so the strategy space that we worked with is called the reactive n strategies. And so a memory n strategy, now I call it Q, is called reactive if it just depends on what the co-player did during the last n rounds. So I don't look what I myself did during the last n rounds. I completely ignore it. I just check what is it that you did. And then I react to it. So this space actually turns out to be not much smaller than the space of memory n strategy. It's just a little bit smaller. So it still things increase exponentially. But it turns out that still you can do some math with these reactive n strategies. All right, just to have some illustration of these things. So this is a very naive illustration of a game. So here's player 1, here's player 2. Player 1 decides the green stuff, player 2 decides the red stuff. So what the memory 1 player does, he just looks at the outcome of the previous round, both the green stuff and the red stuff. What a reactive n player does, he ignores the green stuff, but he looks at the last n red things here. Okay? And given I know what happened during the what you did during the last n rounds, I decide whether I cooperate with you. All right, just to have a few examples. So reactive 1 strategies, they have this form. So here, QC is my probability that I cooperate, given that you cooperated in the previous round. QD is my probability to cooperate, given that you defected in the previous round. And for example, all D is simple, I just always defect. All C is simple, I just always cooperate. Tit for tat is I cooperate if and only if you cooperate in the previous round. So we already knew these strategies from the memory 1 space, because obviously the reactive 1 strategies is a subspace of memory 1. All right, and just to have another example, like the reactive 2 strategies would look like this. I'm afraid things are a little bit confusing. So it looks as if this is a memory 1 strategy, but you need to interpret these entries a little bit differently now. So this is the probability that I cooperate, given that you cooperated 2 times in the last 2 rounds. This is the probability that I cooperate, given that you defected in the last round, but cooperated in the round before. This is the probability that I cooperate, given that you cooperated in the last round, but defected in the round before. So the interpretation of these entries is slightly different. Here, all these indices actually refer to what you did, just in different rounds. Okay. And for example, if you have this representation, you can represent the strategy tit for tat. And this strategy works as follows. Like if there's at least 1 C in your last 2 actions, I cooperate, otherwise I defect. All right, so how does this help? Again, you can derive something like a Press and Dyson analog result. The analog result here is, like if I already know that you play a reactive strategy, reactive n strategy Q, I can always find the best response, Q tilde, among the pure self-reactive n strategies. So what are self-reactive strategies? It's just kind of the dual to reactive strategies. So reactive n strategies would look at what did my opponent do during the last n rounds. A self-reactive n strategy would just look what did I myself do during the last n rounds, and depending on what I did, I would either cooperate or defect. So I guess in Press and Dyson things have been a bit simpler because like the best response to memory 1 was memory 1. So I guess the strategy space was somehow self-contained. Here, the strategy space is not self-contained with respect to best responses. It can be that the best response to a reactive n strategy is not in a reactive n strategy, but you can always find the best response to a reactive n strategy in the space of self-reactive n strategies. And so the intuition that generalizes that you need to have in mind is if you are my opponent and you only look at a certain pieces of information, then I can always find the best response that also looks only at these pieces of information. So if you only look at what I do, then I always find the best response that also only depends on what I do. Okay. All right, so this is a general result. It actually holds not only for like the prisoner's lemma, but also for arbitrary repeated M by M games. It turns out, if you look at the donation game, so the donation game is the game that we've always been talking about, where I pay a cost to give you a benefit. You can make it even simpler. Yeah, by the way, so this is again how reactive and self-reactive strategies work. So reactive strategies would depend on the opponent. Self-reactive strategies would only depend on themselves. Yeah, and I just wanted to say, like, if you look at the special case of a donation game, so the game with B's and C's that we have always been talking about, you can even make it a bit simpler. Then I can say, if the game is a donation game, there's always a best response among the pure self-reactive N-1 strategies. So you can actually afford to know a little bit less than your opponent to play a best response. Yeah, for this, by the way, it's really important that the strategy is, that the original strategy is, oh, by the way, this is a typo here. It shouldn't be memory N, it should be reactive N. Also, this result only holds for reactive N. And it really only holds for the donation game. Okay. And now, once we have this result, by the way, also one more restriction is here. I don't need to check all self-reactive strategies. It suffices to check the pure ones. So that's also, now it's a finite set. So now I don't need to check all uncountably many self-reactive strategies. I just need to check the corner points. So now you kind of have an algorithm to identify whether something is an Nash equilibrium or not. Like you just need to check it against all finitely many self-reactive N strategies. And yeah, so we applied this algorithm to various examples. So for example, we wanted to know when is a nice reactive 2 strategy a Nash equilibrium. So again, a nice reactive 2 strategy would be something that would be that never is the first to defect. Yes, please.
Not understanding this thing. So suppose if it is a self-reactive strategy that a player is playing, so she is looking at her past N actions that she played.
Yep.
So suppose, so it goes according to some sort of an OR gate. One cooperative means I'm going to cooperate again.
Say that again, sorry.
So this tit for tat, I believe it is going according to some sort of an OR gate. One cooperation means I'm going to cooperate again.
Yes, that's right.
So if I am playing this self-reactive, in my last N, if I have one cooperation, I will cooperate. And that cooperation will be carried forward, so forever I'm cooperating. Is it in that way?
Yes, but I'm not saying, like, what exactly this self-reactive N strategy does is not determined. So it's not necessarily the case that this strategy has the property that if it cooperated before, it will cooperate again. So that I cannot say. But I can tell you that if you are interested in the best response to tit for tat, you can look at a strategy that only looks at what it itself did previously, and then it will decide in the previous round, and then it will decide to do in the next round. For example, it might very well be that the best response to tit for tat has this property that it says, well, if I cooperated in the previous round, I cooperate again. If I defected in the previous round, I defect again. Did this make sense?
Main factor, it is the last N rounds.
Yeah, that's right.
So in last N rounds, if I am following the tit for tat which you wrote for reactive 2 strategies, one cooperation coming, meaning forever I'm cooperating.
Oh, yeah. So if you're interested in the best response to tit for tat, yeah, so this result tells you I can find a strategy where I only look at my last 2 rounds, and then I can find some appropriate cooperation probability, and this will be a best response to tit for tat. So I can completely ignore what you did in the previous round. I will only look at myself. Sorry, perhaps if something is still unclear, come to me later. Yeah. All right, so one can actually use this result to now check, for example, among the among the reactive 2 strategies, which of them are Nash. You get these kinds of conditions. So the condition, for example, is if you cooperate twice in a row, I would always cooperate. But that actually follows from this strategy being nice. I would never be the first to defect. And if you always cooperate, I would also always cooperate. Then you get this condition that if you defected once, no matter whether you did 2 rounds ago or in the last round, this is the last round, this is 2 rounds ago, on average, I shouldn't be too cooperative. So this cooperation probability should be bounded by something. And, again, and similarly, like if you defected 2 times in a row, again, I shouldn't be too cooperative. Like I should reduce my cooperation probability. So this is the interpretation of this. And if you look at these formulas, like perhaps 2 things are nice. So one intuition that you might see is that for every defection in memory, you reduce your cooperation probability proportionally. So here you've been defecting in half of all rounds. Therefore, this explains why there is this -1/2. Here you have defected in 100% of all past rounds that I remember. Therefore, here there is a factor of 1. And this principle generalizes. So even you can similarly derive conditions for reactive-free strategies and even some subclass of reactive end strategies, and you would always see this kind of principle. Okay. All right. So this is the part where we try to do analytical stuff. But the other question that we might have is now, if you do simulations, like to which extent do results change as you go from, for example, reactive 1 to reactive 2 to reactive 3? To which extent is more memory actually an advantage in evolving populations? And to analyze that, we look at the standard setup. Well, we just give ourselves a population of size n. We just assume that players adopt some random reactive end strategies. They play against everyone else, and then they get some payoff. And then we assume that strategies that yield a higher payoff than the others, they would reproduce more often. So what we use here, I believe, is a pairwise comparison process, but you could also use a Moran process. They are pretty much the same in this regard. And then the question is, like, what is the effect of memory on evolving cooperation rates? So are there any guesses? Does more memory help to get more cooperation, like in evolving populations? Not necessarily. That's right, yeah, that's right. So sometimes it's actually good to forget. Yeah, that's right. Any other guesses? Yeah, so this is the result that we see. So here on the x-axis, you have the cost of cooperation. The benefit here is normalized to 1. Here on the y-axis, you have the cooperation rate. So red is reactive 1, green is reactive 2, blue is reactive 3. So we see, at least for these 3 strategy spaces that we actually could simulate, there is an advantage of more memory. But there is actually a truth to that more memory does not always need to help because, okay, so this is if you do simulations for reactive end strategies. We also did simulations for a slightly simpler strategy space, which we call the reactive end counting space. And so a counting strategy is a strategy that ignores the timing of your cooperation defection. I just check among the past n rounds, how often did you cooperate? Oh, I see you've cooperated 5 times out of the last 8 rounds, so therefore I cooperate with this probability. So it's actually a subspace of reactive end strategies. Because for reactive end strategies, you can also condition on the exact timing of actions. For example, I might want to punish you if you defected in the last round, but if the defection was already 5 rounds ago, I ignore it, like it means nothing to me. And so counting strategies are a little bit different. So they completely ignore the timing, and they just look at the proportion of how often did you cooperate during the last n rounds. And if you would do such simulations for counting strategies, you would see very little difference between n equals 1, n equals 2, and n equals 3. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so my summary for this part now is like, it's quite interesting to look at higher memory. Things become a little bit complicated and tricky, but still, like, there are analytical tools out there that help you, that are your friend. And still some simulations are feasible until n equals 3 in our case. Perhaps you can do it better. Yeah, all right. So this is the first part of my talk. So this is about the role of memory. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So counting strategies look like this. For example, let's say n equals 4. And like reactive end strategies would look like really complicated. Like they would depend on like what you did 4 rounds ago, what you did 3 rounds ago, what you did 2 rounds ago, and what you did last round. So in particular, you would have, it would be a 16-dimensional space if you look at all reactive force strategies. Counting strategies look like this. So it's Q4, Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0. And what this means is just, this is my cooperation probability, given that I know during the last 4 rounds you cooperated 4 times. This is my cooperation probability, given that I know during the last 4 rounds you cooperated 3 times, and so on. Yeah. Perfect. All right, the next thing is about the effect of changing environments. So this, yeah, please. I mean, that's a great question. So, for example, like analytically, they don't. So, for example, if you look at this thing, it really doesn't make a difference. Like for a strategy being Nash, it really doesn't make a difference whether you would only punish if a defection was recent, or whether you would like to punish whether a defection happened 2 rounds ago. Like, I mean, I should say that these are results for infinitely repeated games with no discounting. Perhaps in the case of discounting, things are different. But if you look at infinitely repeated games without discounting, it really doesn't make a difference when you punish. Just you should punish with the right probability. Like on average, so for example, I could always punish with 1 round delay. It would be completely fine. So the next round I pretend as if nothing happened, but the round after I'm really strict. It would be totally fine from an analytical perspective. So this, as long as this inequality holds, everything is fine. It turns out if you run simulations and look at the strategies that are very successful, it turns out that most of the evolving strategies actually have this recency bias, that they would punish a defection immediately. And it took us quite some time to find out why this is even the case, because like analytically, there's no reason to distinguish between them. And the reason is, like, if there's only a small amount of noise in your simulations, for example, here I assume that QCC is equal to 1, but if you randomly create mutants within the space, you will never have a strategy that exactly has probability 1 of cooperating after QCC, but rather you will have something like QCC equals to 0.99. And once there is this noise, actually like this symmetry here breaks, and then for some reason it becomes advantageous to actually punish defection immediately. All right. Yeah, so now about the effect of changing environments. Yeah, so I mean, I guess we all agree that the repeated business lemma is a very important model in evolutionary biology and in evolutionary game theory. So is it the answer? Like, is anything that we can learn learnable by the repeated business lemma? And I would say, well, the repeated business lemma is great. I've been working on it for many years, but it's also a bit stylized in 2 senses. Like the first is, like usually, at least how we do it, we assume that the game is symmetric. So by that I mean that we both have the same cooperation costs, we have the same benefit of cooperation, so things are the same. And the other thing that is perhaps a little bit artificial in some scenarios is that the player's environment, the games they play, do not change. Like we always play the very same game over and over again. And for example, something else that you might want to consider is a setup like that. Like for example, there might be 2 environments, like a good environment and a bad environment. Perhaps you start out in a good environment and then you can play this kind of business dilemma. But perhaps the situation is such that once too many players defect, the environment deteriorates. Like, by the way, environment here could be ecological environment, it could also be a social environment. But once too many players defect, you go to an entirely different game the next round. So for example, it could be a work team and if you all cooperate, you will get assigned a good job the next time you're asked to do something. But if you completely fail, then the boss will give you a bad job that you really don't want to do. Or you think of the tragedy of the commons, where this is really the ecological environment, and if you defect too much, if you exploit too many resources, then you end up in a bad environment. So this is the kind of question that I would like to explore. And if you think about it, like also from a theoretical viewpoint, this is actually an interesting setup because here it's no longer clear whether tit for tat can help you. Because if you think about why was tit for tat good in Axelrod's tournament, it was good because it really had this logic. If you defect against me now, I can punish you in the next round just as much as you hurted me this round. But now if you play this kind of game, it's no longer true that in the next round I can punish you in the very same way, because like you might have defected here, and then I can only defect now here, and that might hurt you less than it did hurt you here. All right, so this is one reason why you might be interested in this set. All right, so let me define what this class of games is. So this class of games is called stochastic games. Again, we consider a set of n players. Like most of the time, again, we assume that n equals 2, so we look at groups of 2. Like these players can find themselves in m different states. I mean, perhaps sometimes it helps to think of these states as different states of the environment. And in each state, they play some different one-shot game, where they can either cooperate or defect. And now the interesting thing about stochastic games is like, well, obviously the actions of the players determine their immediate payoffs, but now in stochastic games, they also determine to which state you move next. So for example, if everyone cooperates, you might be more likely to end up in a good state. Like things can be stochastic. So here I give a very deterministic example how these transitions might work. But it could also be stochastic, where if you both cooperate, we end up here with 90% probability. But if one of us defects, we end up here with, I don't know, 80% probability. So things don't need to be deterministic here. And if you take the word stochastic games serious, then perhaps there should be some chance here. All right, and again, for this setup, other than that, we do the same kind of analysis that we did for the repeated persistence lemma. So again, in this case, we look at memory 1 strategies. So what does it mean in this case to look at memory 1 strategies? Obviously, what I do now needs to depend on, for the case of 2 players and 2 states, what I do now depends on what I did in the previous round and what you did in the previous round. But now we also would like to be able to condition on what is the state that we are in at the moment. So, because, for example, you might have a very strong incentive when you are in state 1, but you might have not such a strong incentive to cooperate when you are in state 2. And we would like our strategy space to be rich enough to make these kinds of distinctions. All right, the player's payoff in the stochastic game. Here, we typically look at the just infinitely repeated game with no discounting. So it's again this limit. And in our case, like with these finite memory strategies, this limit is guaranteed to exist. All right, so let's look at the first example. Oh yeah, okay, I should tell you again how evolution works, but evolution works the same way as it did before. So again, we consider a large population of players, like say this population is of size capital N, then players are randomly matched to play against each other in these stochastic games, and then strategies that yield a higher payoff are more likely to reproduce. So in principle, the evolutionary process is the same as before. And then the question is, okay, like what's the effect of these stochastic games? And just so the first example that we played with is really this example where there is a good state, there is a bad state. We are only in a good state if we both cooperate. Otherwise, we immediately go to bad state. And just to have something to compare this to, we also looked at an example where we just always played a good game, and an example where we always played a bad game. Yeah.
When you match 2 players randomly, they are like for n rounds they are matched, or like they're randomly again for.
Yeah. No, they are matched for the entire duration of the stochastic game. So for many rounds. Yeah.
Evolutionary time step, then you will change the player.
Yeah, I mean, to be more precise, actually, like in each evolution time step, I play actually many stochastic games against many random opponents. So in some sense, I compute expected payoffs. If I randomly meet another player, what would be the expected payoff that I get if I play this stochastic game? Does this make sense?
But then it's not changing the repeated framework, like, so I'm
yeah.
the same opponent, then I can using the strategy that he cooperated in the last round.
That's right. So to be a little bit more precise, I do the following thing. So this is my population, and suppose I now want to compute the players' payoffs here. So what I do is, like, for example, I randomly match those two, and then they play this stochastic game over many rounds. Yeah, but then I don't stop there to compute the payoffs. I also like randomly match it with this person, for example. Like I do many of these random matches just to get a sense of how good this strategy here is on average against the other players in the population. All right? Yeah. Yes, please. I mean, that's a very great question. So in the strategy space that I assumed the players always perfectly know in which state they are. And obviously, I mean, that's an idealization because like, if you think of the climate change game that we are playing right now, I mean, we have very incomplete information of how bad it really is at the moment. I mean, we looked in some paper what happens if you have incomplete information and compared it to complete information. And what we saw there is that most of the time, you can get much more cooperation if you have complete information of the current state of the environment. All right, so this is the setup that we looked at. So we did run simulations for the stochastic game. We did run simulations for if you only play game 1. We did do simulations if you only play game 2. So this is roughly how things look like. So we set the cost here to equal to 1. In the good game, there is a benefit of 2. In the bad game, there is a benefit of 1.2. So what we did is we ran simulations. So here is time. Here there is cooperation rate. And now if you look at the bad game, I mean, this benefit value is just too small to get the cooperation. Like even if there is a repeated game, usually you don't see cooperation for such a small benefit value. So we saw something like this. And now for the good game, so B1 is 2, I mean, that's already more. So you get a little bit more cooperation. So what you see here is something like this. Any guesses where the stochastic game is here? Yeah, but you know the paper. Or you have an intuitive guess. Yeah, all right, yeah. So you use some higher order rationality here actually to infer what will happen. Yeah, actually when I was thinking of myself how I should draw this graph, I was actually wondering whether I should cheat a little bit, whether I should just draw it until here, because then you don't have to guess that the true curve might actually go much higher. So I assume your guess is something like this. Is this right? Yeah, and this guess, in fact, is correct. So this is how it looks like. Now, given that this is the result, and if you now stare at this stochastic game, can you give me some interpretation of why this happens? Like, is this in any way intuitive? Yeah. That's right, yeah. So I also believe that's the right intuition. So the intuition is kind of, the stochastic game, like you can almost think of nature as a third player in this game here. And nature decides which payoff matrix you play next round. And here, nature has a very strict strategy. Like, if one of you defects, then I really punish you by letting you play the bad game. And so kind of this third player nature really here incentivizes cooperation. Okay, so the next question is, like, here I looked at a very specific kind of transition structure. You might ask yourself, okay, like for other kinds of transition structures, like for example, if already one cooperator would be enough to stay in this state, would it still work? So the next thing that we did is actually to systematically check what happens for different kinds of transition structures. So for example, I mean, this case actually corresponds to this case. This now is a new game. Like here we are in the good state only if at least one player cooperated. If both defected, we are in the bad state. This is kind of the game that we already looked at, and here are all other cases. And we just systematically repeated the simulation for all these different games, and we checked in which of these games do we get cooperation, just to see, is there a pattern? And the thing that we see here is this. So here you need to focus on the lower graph here. So here there are these 8 different transition structures. And on the y-axis, there is cooperation rate. And you see there are exactly 2 stochastic games for which you get a lot of cooperation. So this is the game that we just looked at and this other game. And what is it that these 2 games have in common? So they have in common that if both cooperate, you are in the good state. If both defect, you are in the bad state. So apparently it doesn't matter too much what happens if only one of us cooperates, but it matters a lot what happens if 2 of us cooperate and if none of us cooperates. Here, what do I mean by cooperation? Is this a question? Yeah. So it means, like, obviously I play all these games across all these population members, and just at each generation I record out of all the games that we played, how often do I cooperate? I do not even distinguish between cooperation in state 1 and cooperation in state 2. I just average over all instances of cooperation here. Yes? That's right. Okay, I believe there are 2 aspects to your question. The first aspect is perhaps how did I calculate things? The way how I calculate things is, again, the same thing, like as with repeated games. Like the thing is, like if you have the stochastic games, you can represent them as a Markov chain. Just now, instead of a 4x4 transition matrix, you would have an 8x8 transition matrix. Again, you can calculate what is the stationary distribution of this Markov chain. And given the stationary distribution, you can compute payoffs. So perhaps that was the E. That's right, yeah. Given that I know my strategy, given that I know your strategy, I can compute what is the payoff that we would get on average. That's right, yeah. So again, what I assume here is a separation of time scales. So I keep my strategy for the entire duration of the stochastic game, and only once I'm done with my stochastic games, I consider switching my strategy. Yeah.
Sometimes it happens that the environment is changing independent of what I'm doing.
That's right.
And if I'm in a bad environment and if I cooperate, I'll get something less. And if I'm just, it's not in my control or something, some, let's say, external agency or something.
That's right,
so
yeah.
In that situation, will there be increase in the cooperation rate or like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I guess the question here is like, here I assumed that things depend on what we did, but you could also just assume that it's a matter of chance. Like with probability 2/3 you go here, with probability 1/3 you go there. It might even depend on the present state, whether you, like what is the switching probability. Again, you can ask, like, would it be now more likely that you get cooperation? So it is a totally legitimate question within the stochastic games. You can totally model it. The truth is, I don't know. We didn't study it. Yes, please.
Would the number of states in any way affect the kind of result that we're seeing? In the sense, if I have a good, bad, and even a worse environment, if we add the number of states, does that in any way affect the kind of result that we're seeing?
It can. I will give an example in a minute. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So this is still sort of a 2-player game, right?
Yeah.
One person whose behavior I predicted from 2 players to sort of more multiple players, like empty finite still.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. There are 2 answers to this. Like the first answer is like experimentally what you would see real humans do. Like experimentally, you really see that group size has a huge effect. Like you get cooperation in groups of 2 much easier than you get cooperation in groups of 4. Now, theoretically, like if you do these kinds of simulations, it's often the case that simulations would overestimate how much cooperation you get. I will show an example in a minute. Yeah, by the way, there's one more aspect to your question. How do people actually imitate each other? And how do they know each other's, like how do we know their payoffs? Like for us as a researcher, it's simple, like we do these Markov chain calculations and that's how we do it. You could ask like how realistic is this model? Like how well can I estimate actually your payoff? And also how well can I actually estimate your strategy? Like even if I see that you do really well, I might not perfectly know your strategy, but in these simulations, we usually assume that I perfectly know your strategy and I can perfectly imitate it. So also, like this is, I guess, a simplifying assumption. Yeah, all right. And so the next step is, again, to have one example in larger groups. Suppose now the game is played in groups of 4 players. Yeah, please. have no clue at all. Yeah. So there is some literature on continuous stochastic games in the static game theory literature. So, like, there are people who try to characterize the equilibria of such things. I know nothing that looks at, no evolutionary analysis of such stochastic games. Yeah, all right, so now cooperation in larger groups. Suppose now the game is played in groups of 4 players, and okay, so now they don't play the prisoner's dilemma anymore, now they play the public good game. So the public good game is, we get an endowment, and then I can either decide to contribute this endowment or to keep it for myself. Endowments are multiplied by some productivity factor R, and then everything is split evenly among us. So it's again like a social dilemma I would like to defect in one round and hope that everyone else cooperates. Yeah, just the interesting thing here is that like the multiplication factor here might depend on the state. So in a good state, we have a high multiplication factor. In a bad state, for example, we have a low multiplication factor. Also, the number of cooperators determines the next state. So this is similar to before. And also we consider 4 different treatments. Like now we actually allow for more than 2 states. And we consider 4 different treatments, and they differ by how quickly the environment deteriorates. And so this is the illustration. In fact, we have 5 environmental states. The best state, you are only in the best state if everyone cooperated. You're in the second best state if at least 3 of us cooperated, and so on. And now the question is, like, how quickly does the environment deteriorate as a function of your state? And here we consider 4 different treatments. Like, the first treatment is the environment doesn't deteriorate at all. Like, you just always play with the high multiplication factor. Another treatment is that the environment reacts very late. So it only reacts if really every one of us defected, then you're in a bad environment. Otherwise, you still are in a good environment. And also you have the opposite, that the environment reacts immediately. And then you have something in between where the environment reacts gradually. So these are the 4 treatments that we're interested in. And again, we did the same thing, like we looked at evolving populations, like players can update their strategies over time. The question is, like in these 4 different treatments, what do you think gives the most cooperation? Do you have any intuition? Sorry? Gradual? Immediate? Can you give a justification?
Because they feel that the moment I take a bad decision, it's going to deteriorate immediately.
Yeah.
I should never not cooperate.
Yeah. Yeah. Good justification. Do you have a justification for gradual?
When the environment deteriorates, the incentive to cooperate also goes down, right?
Sorry, say that again.
When the environment deteriorates, the incentive to cooperate also goes down.
That's right. Yeah.
So if it goes on immediately, I thought, okay, now I'm already in a bad place. No, I don't have incentive to cooperate. But if it's gradual, I get a constant feedback. So I thought that might.
That's right. Yeah. So your argument is like, if I happen to be in state 3, like, and if it was an immediate, like now, I really have a very weak incentive to cooperate. So once, I mean, as long as you're here, you have a strong incentive to cooperate. But once we are here, you would have a very weak incentive to cooperate, and then perhaps we get stuck. Still, it might happen that you really want to go up there, so you have this collective effort to cooperate. So still, you might have some, even down here, you might have some incentive now that everyone cooperates. Any other favorites? Yeah. All right. So I guess we have 2 candidates here, immediate and gradual. The winner is immediate. Yeah, I pretty much subscribe to your explanation, I believe. My feeling from these stochastic games, like we mostly explored with simulations, we have a few analytical results, but my feelings that I got is that the environment should show a strict reaction to what you do. Yeah. All right, so this is it about stochastic games. So I just want to convince you that there are interesting effects once you assume that the environment is not constant, that you can actually affect your environment. All right, so we are done with the second part. Now the last part, impact of inequality. Yeah, do you have a question? Yeah.
Who doesn't cooperate if three others, who defects if 3 others defects or something like that?
Yeah, perfect. So the question is like, I somehow hand-waving made this argument that you can interpret nature as a third player. Can one make this hand-waving argument a little bit more precise? The way how you can make it a little bit more precise is if you construct the transition matrix of this Markov chain, it turns out that how you implement the actions of nature, like you have this, also nature has a transition vector, like actually how you represent these transitions is as follows. For example, in a two-player game, transitions would look like something like this. It's QCC, QCD, QDC, and QDD. So this is the probability to be in the good state, given that both players cooperated in the previous round. This is the probability to be in a good state, given that one player cooperated, the other one defected. So this already looks suspiciously similar to what we previously had for a memory one strategy. And also, if you look at the entries of the transition matrix, like the way how these variables go into the transition matrix is exactly how you would do it if nature was actually a player. So in this case, you can make it a little bit more precise. The only difference, perhaps, between this being a real player and this being nature is that if you are interested in Nash equilibrium, everyone needs to optimize something. But obviously, nature doesn't need to optimize something. So these are fixed parameters. You just ignore them. Like you are not even trying to maximize anything for nature. Also, I mean, one assumption that we make here in all of this analysis is that nature doesn't care who defects. So I mean, that's an assumption, because like obviously for the climate game, it does make a difference whether the USA defects or whether Austria defects. But we only look at kind of symmetric games where nature doesn't make a difference between who defects here. Like QCD would be the same as QDC. All right. Yeah, so now to the last part. So in evolutionary game theory, we really like symmetric games. I mean, there are some interesting examples of asymmetric games that are studied. But like I would say for every asymmetric game that is studied in evolutionary game theory, you see at least 5 papers on symmetric games. And one interesting question, why is that? To me, one answer is like it makes this, quite often it makes the description and the math much easier, and sometimes it also makes the interpretation of results a little bit easier. I mean, but one question that you might still have is like many social dilemmas in reality are asymmetric. So for example, this climate game that we're playing right now is a highly asymmetric game between countries. And so perhaps the better setup, so this is the classical symmetric game. And perhaps, and what is nice about the symmetric game from an evolutionary game theory perspective, like at least in theoretical biology, you can easily model how evolution works in these kinds of games by imitation. Because we all play the same game. If I know what works for you, I know what works for me. But now, perhaps we don't play the symmetric game anymore. Perhaps that there are 3 kinds of players. There's a player with a lot of endowment, a very rich player if you want so. There's a player who has very little endowment, and so on. So this now is a representation of a public good game. Usually in public good game, everyone has the same endowment, but you might easily think of situations where players actually have different sets of endowments. Yeah. So why asymmetry is non-trivial? So the first answer is, again, because it's no longer clear whether tit for tat would give you a good performance. Because, like, again, tit for tat is based on this analogy. Whenever you hurt me, I can hurt you in the very same way. But this is no longer true in these asymmetric games, because, like, if the rich player hurts me, then the poor player cannot hurt the rich player in the same way. And if you think of current tariff conflicts, this pretty much seems to be going on at the moment. Yeah, and the other problem is, like at least from an evolutionary perspective, like from a theoretical biology perspective, it's no longer clear how we should model learning in these asymmetric games. So it seems quite clear that you shouldn't do imitation dynamics anymore. Obviously, you could use other dynamics such as logit dynamics that we heard earlier, but that's also like logit dynamics is a little bit hard to do if you have uncountably many strategies. So then it becomes very technical very quickly. Yeah, and of course we are not the first to work on asymmetric games. So there has been some work on cooperation in asymmetric social dilemmas. So I just give here 2 random examples. There would be many more. Usually what these studies find is like they really look at these kinds of public good games with asymmetric endowments. And what they usually find is that asymmetric endowments hurt cooperation. Like once players become unequal, it really makes it difficult to sustain cooperation. And so one question that we had is endowment inequality always detrimental? Like, or can we find exceptions somehow? All right, so the setup that we use for this question is the following. Like, again, we consider a group of n individuals who interact repeatedly. And in each individual I obtains some endowment EI. So now different individuals might get different endowments. The rules are such that, again, individuals independently decide how much they want to contribute to a public good. We allow for a second source of asymmetry. The second source of asymmetry is our productivity. So if I contribute something to the public good, my contributions to the public good might be more valuable than someone else's contribution. Like you might think of teamwork, and the project happens to be about evolutionary game theory, and perhaps I interact with someone who knows nothing about evolutionary game theory, then perhaps my contributions are more effective to the team project than someone else's contributions. So therefore, we allow this multiplication factor R now to depend on the individual. Still, the rules would be such that whatever I contribute are multiplied by my productivity factor, and then whatever comes out of it, like the sum of everything, is evenly split among all players. Yeah.
Is it correlated with endowment, like more endowment and more multiplication factor, or is it completely?
It could be. We actually come back to that later, but at this point, it's completely independent. So you could use arbitrary R values. The only restriction that we make is that R shouldn't be too large. So it should still have a social dilemma character. Yeah, so this is how the game looks like. So we have these asymmetric games. Players have different endowments. In this case, they happen to have the same productivities, and they play the game over and over again. Yeah, so the research question is, for given productivities, how should we optimally allocate endowments to maximize cooperation? So is it always true that I should equally split endowments among all players to maximize cooperation? So this is the question. All right, so we started with a simple case. So the simple case is that, okay, we keep the productivities the same. So with respect to productivities, the game is still symmetric. We ask ourselves, how should we allocate endowments in order to maximize cooperation? And like the first way how we approach this question is, we ask ourselves, when is there an equilibrium in which players can actually achieve full cooperation? So we fix the parameters of the game, we fix the continuation probability, we fix the productivities. The only thing that we can play with is the endowments, like how I would like to allocate endowments to the different players. And we ask ourselves, how should I allocate these endowments to the players such that there is an equilibrium in which they would fully cooperate all the time, in which they would give all their endowments to the public good. Now I show you these triangles. These triangles are a little bit deceptive if you know evolutionary game theory, because now, like in my first lecture, these triangles actually represented different strategies. Now this triangle doesn't represent different strategies. It represents how you could possibly allocate endowments among the 3 players. So for example, this point would correspond to the point where I give all of the endowments. Suppose the total endowment is normalized to 1. This point would mean I give all of the initial endowment to player 3. This point would mean I give all of the initial endowment to player 1. For example, this point would mean I give half of the endowment to player 3, half of the endowment to player 2. And this X in the middle marks the treasure. It means that everyone gets the same endowment. And then we ask ourselves, okay, like where in this triangle can we actually find an equilibrium which gives you full cooperation? And like you can do this analytically, and then you get a blue region, like you get this region where cooperation is feasible. And then you can try to prove things. Like, for example, you see some regularities here. Like you see that the blue region is not at the corners. And that is true more generally. Like you should never give the full endowment to one single player, because then you only get full defection. The other thing that you see is that this blue region is a superset of this X. And that is also generalizable. So this will always be true. Like if the productivities are equal, It will always be true that if anything can give you cooperation, an equal split of endowments can give you cooperation. So in this sense, for example, if I reduce the continuation probability delta, this blue region will shrink. So it will become smaller and smaller. It will become increasingly hard to get cooperation. But as long as this blue region exists, it will always be true that this X is an element of this blue region. So in this very sense, it is true that full equality in endowments helps you to cooperate. Yeah.
The blue region means cooperation means everyone contributes the complete endowment.
That's right. Yeah. So this is.
White region, there could be players who contribute something, but you don't have full cooperation.
That's right. Yeah, we didn't look at this. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Like here, we really looked at full cooperation. You could be interested in partial cooperation, and that might also be very relevant for the world today. Like even if the US is not interested in preventing climate change at the moment, still we might try to get some coalition of other players who try to do some cooperation. So this is also a very relevant question, but a question that we didn't explore here. Yeah.
If you leave one player and don't give any endowment, still there is cooperation from the plot at least.
That's right. So for example, here you would get full cooperation. Here player one gets no endowment. So you could say that player one cooperates trivially, like he gives all of his endowments to the public good, which happens to be 0. The other two players here would cooperate fully. Yeah. So this is the way how you need to interpret it. It's a slightly degenerate case.
You're leaving a poor guy and still there's cooperation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, please. Sorry.
How are you getting this blue region?
The way how you do it is like you characterize the equilibrium of this game. So I didn't show the calculations here, but you ask yourself, like, can I find an equilibrium that would be like, given you are at the point in this triangle, like given that you allocate endowment somehow to the players, you ask yourself, can I find strategies that fully cooperate with each other that are an equilibrium? And now this task is simplified by a result that shows, like if you, the most effective strategies to get you to cooperation is always the strategy Grim Trigger. So if there's any strategy that gives you full cooperation, it's usually Grim Trigger. Like Grim Trigger means that you give your full endowment as long as everyone else does. As soon as someone deviates, you deviate as well. So you make the assumption that everyone plays Grim Trigger, and then you check, does any one of the players have an incentive to deviate? And then for the white regions, you find that there is some incentive to deviate from Grim Trigger. In the blue regions, you find that there is no incentive to deviate. So this is how the calculation is done. Does this make sense?
I think so. It's an equilateral triangle that you're dealing with.
Yes, here everything is perfectly symmetric. So this is the unit simplex, how you would call it. So yeah.
And that is the centroid, that X.
Pardon?
The X is the centroid.
Yeah, X is the center here. So the point, yeah. So I mean, the way how you need to interpret these triangles is again, like actually this thing lives in three-dimensional space. So this is the endowment that goes to player 1. This is the endowment that goes to player 2. This is the endowment that goes to player 3. Now, but for simplicity, I actually normalize endowment. So I assume that the total endowment that players could possibly get is normalized to 1. So for example, one point that you could have is this one here. This is 1, 0, 0. You give everything to player 1. This point here is 0, 1, 0. You give everything to player 2. This point here is you give everything to player 3. And then, because things are normalized, like you would always allocate the full amount, actually the space of all possible allocations looks like this. And in particular, if you ask yourself, where is the point 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you would find it somewhere here. And this is the two-dimensional projection of this three-dimensional thing. Okay? Yeah, so this was the easy case where productivities were symmetric. Now let's ask ourselves, like, how do things change if now productivities are asymmetric? So this is now how the blue region looks like. Like here we have an example where the first player is really productive, the second player is far less productive, and the third player is hardly any productive. And what you see here is, like again, two regularities. Like the first regularity is like you never get cooperation in the corners, like there is never a blue region here. But the other kind of interesting thing that you see is like equal endowments is no longer optimal for cooperation. So here you have a game where equal endowments wouldn't give you full cooperation, but an asymmetric endowment distribution would actually give you full cooperation. And I mean, it's also interesting to see in which direction this blue region moves. It moves to the direction of the most productive player. And this goes back to your question, like, is there some correlation between endowments and productivities? According to the game, not, but if you're interested in equilibria, there should be. That's right, yeah, absolutely correct. So white here doesn't mean that there's no cooperation at all possible. So it could still be that some players cooperate. It could also be that like even the rich player, like even one player contributes to some extent, like a player who wouldn't find it worthwhile to give the full endowment, like you still might find equilibria in which this player cooperates at least 50% of his endowment, just to show some goodwill. Yeah, so this is really an extreme scenario to get some intuitions.
So the white region contains those points like that people participating and the regions where everybody is dependent.
That's right, yeah. And perhaps that's the only strict statement that we can make. In the corners, you really only have one equilibrium that is full defection. But in the other parts of the white regions, there could be some other equilibria that give you at least some cooperation. That's right, yeah. So the blue region here says I can get 100% cooperation. Like I could perhaps draw an analogous region where at least 90% of the endowments is contributed and then 80%. So you would get this nice landscape. Unfortunately, this is a much harder question to do somehow because then suddenly you need to ask yourself, what are all the kinds of equilibria that give rise to 90% cooperation? And then you need to characterize the stability of these equilibria. And so everything becomes a little bit more complicated. And here we were lazy and went the easy way. Yeah. I mean, for the analytical results, there actually is. Like, we allow deviations towards partial cooperation. Just later on, we also do simulations, and in the simulations, we only assume that players either give their full endowment or nothing at all. Yeah.
How are you interpreting productivity is just contribution to endowment, but then is that in terms of just work, or is that in terms of literal sort of like wealth to the endowment?
Could you say this question again?
How are you interpreting productivity? Is it just cash, or is it contribution as in, how do you contribute to what happens in the system?
Yeah, perhaps here the better interpretation is that here endowments is actually like how much, contribution is actually how much time, for example, you invest into public good. And then R is a little bit easy to interpret, like because the two of us might have different productivities. If you really interpret it as money, it's a little bit hard to justify that my money is more productive than yours. Yeah. All right. So these are the static results. We also did some evolutionary simulations, and as I mentioned there, we make a simplification. We only allow players to either give their full endowment or nothing at all. But otherwise, things are pretty much the same as they've always been. Like players play these games to get some payoffs, then they imitate strategies that get a better payoff. And for these simulations, then we systematically vary like how much endowments do players get, and we run a simulation for each point here on this triangle. We run a different simulation. And we just record how much cooperation do we get. And the result is what you see here. So you see pretty much the same qualitative result. So here you see the most cooperation in the center. Here you see the most cooperation somewhere up here. All right, so these are our theory results. In the end, we also decided it would be nice actually to compare this, like to see whether any of this is actually has some analog in reality. So we did run an experiment. So for this experiment, we recruited subjects, in this case from Amazon Turk, which is this online labor market, like where you can just hire people online to do a task for you. And in this case, we did let them play a game against a randomly chosen opponent. They play a repeated public good game in groups of 2, so we try to make things simpler than they were here. So we don't look at 3-player games, we only look at 2-player games. They are a little bit easier to handle. All groups interact for at least 20 rounds. After the 20th round, there would be a continuation probability of 50% in this case. And also for this experiment, we systematically try to vary, like, what are the players' endowments? Are they equal or unequal? And what are the players' productivities? Are they equal or unequal? And then if you do this, it turns out you get 5 treatments. So these are the 5 treatments. So productivities can be either, endowments can either be equal or unequal. So if they are equal, players always get 50-50 endowment. If they are unequal, like player 1 would get, for example, here 75, and the other player would only get 25. Also, productivities can either be equal or unequal. So in this case, we assume that if they are equal, the productivity factor would be 1.6. And if they are unequal, one player would have a productivity factor of 1.9, and one player would have a productivity factor of 1.3. Now the question is, like, obviously you always have 2 variations. Why are there 5 treatments and not 4? The difference, the critical thing is, like, what happens if you have both unequal endowments and unequal productivities? The question is exactly what your question was, like, is there a positive correlation between endowments and productivities, or is there a negative correlation between productivities and endowments? So the first case we call aligned inequality, and the second case we call misaligned inequality. And now the question is, which of these 5 treatments gives you the most cooperation? And yeah, so the first thing, like, and remember, we made 2 sets of predictions. Like, the first set of predictions was, if players have equal productivities, then we should actually see more cooperation if also their endowments are equal than if their endowments are unequal. And so this is also what we got. So if we look at cooperation rates, and we only look at those groups that have equal productivities, you see that you get more cooperation in the IISER plus if there's full equality rather than endowment inequality. Yeah, so by the way, so here the y-axis shows relative contributions, like which proportion of the endowment did they contribute to the public good. So here actually they could contribute any amount between 0 and their endowment. The generated surplus is just how much more did they get, like on the group level, how much more did the groups earn compared to their initial endowments. All right, so this is what we got now for equal productivities. For unequal productivities, this is now what we got. So we see actually still a lot of cooperation if players get equal endowments, if they're only different in their productivity. But we see pretty much the same, perhaps even a little bit more cooperation under this aligned inequality. We see much less cooperation if inequality is misaligned. And on the level of the surplus, clearly aligned inequality is the best thing that can happen, because the difference here between this case and this case is, if you assign endowments according to their productivity, like if you give more of the endowment to the more productive player, and if this player cooperates, like contributes the whole amount, then it will be multiplied by the larger productivity factor. So this explains why you would see a higher surplus under aligned inequality rather than productivity inequality. All right, so the summary for our question is, like, how should we allocate endowments if we want to maximize cooperation? And the answer, at least for these linear public good games that we studied here, is, well, it depends actually on the other parameters of the game. If the parameters are otherwise symmetric, then also endowment should be symmetric. But if players differ along some other interesting dimension that has some impact on the game, then there is good reason to believe that also endowments, for example, should be allocated asymmetrically. All right. Yeah, so we are at the end. So this is the summary over the whole lecture series. So I tried to give you some introduction about evolutionary game theory, like replicator dynamics, about the Moran process. And I also tried to illustrate how we can use these techniques to ask some interesting questions about cooperation, like, for example, direct and indirect reciprocity. I hope you found it useful. I found it very nice. Thank you. You were a very engaging audience. It was really nice.
All the nice theorems you showed were for 2 action games. Are you aware of any analytical result with 3 action repeated games?
I mean, here in the last part, like, is asymmetric. Okay, yeah. In the previous part,
the reactive memory one, they were for 2 action games, right? So
yeah.
One wanted to do a repeated game with RPS game. Are there analytical results? No.
That's right. So for the first part of my talk today, like reactive end strategy, for example, or also more generally about the results on direct reciprocity, I usually talked about two-player games. You might ask yourself, like, are there any interesting theorems for n-player games? There are a few interesting theorems, but usually they are weaker, in the sense that, for example, you can characterize all nice memory one strategies that give rise to full cooperation, but only among the pure memory one strategies. Not so far, I don't know of any proof that can characterize all these nice strategies if you also allow players to randomize.
No, I was not talking about n-player games.
I
was talking about a 3x3 matrix.
Oh, okay. So for
rock, paper, scissors.
There are not too many repeated 3-player games out there. Like there is perhaps 1 or 2 players that, instead of the prisoner's dilemma where you only can cooperate or defect, they look at repeated games where you can cooperate, defect, and punish, and look at the repeated version of that. I mean, those authors that conclude that in equilibrium most people do not punish, but I'm not even sure how generalizable this result is. But in general, there's much less work on M-action games than on 2-action games. Yeah.
So here we talked about the completeness of memory strategies in the context of iterative prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm just asking, are there similar results for other repeated games?
Like there is at least one paper out there that tried to do things systematically. So like what this paper did is, like you can look at payoff matrices like that, like you just normalize this to 1, you can normalize this to 0, this is T and this is S. So you have this 2-dimensional space of possible games. So what you can do then is like you can, here is T, here is S, and then for each point here on this plane, like you could simulate, for example, evolutionary dynamics and see how much of cooperation you get. And there is one paper out there that does exactly that. So for example, you would see that, and also looks at which kinds of memory one strategies actually evolve. So you would see that, for example, in the prisoner's dilemma quadrant, you would see a lot of win, steal, lose, shift evolving, a lot of cooperation. Then, for example, for stag hunt games, you would see a lot of all C evolving, because like all C by itself is already in equilibrium. In the harmony game, you would also, like, when cooperation becomes a dominant strategy already in a one-shot game, also in a repeated game, you would see a lot of cooperation. Things are a little bit messy for snowdrift games in this last fourth quadrant. Oh, yeah, the completeness of the strategy. So the result that I mentioned today, this result by Press and Dyson, that whenever I play a memory one strategy, you can also play a memory one strategy. That is actually independent of the payoff matrix that you use. It doesn't need to be on the prisoner's dilemma. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's thank Krishna again for a really engaging session.
Thanks.